South Orange Library Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. We have one of my favorite speakers, Doug Simon, who first spoke here on February 9th, 1989 on the topic Vietnam Retrospective, 20 years after Tet. This was a lecture based on Professor Simon's role in the Vietnam War as a military advisor. Then he spoke October 12th in '89 on New Faces of Communism and how it affects U.S. foreign policy. In 1990, the nature of international conflict in the current decades. And after that, Doug came twice a year, and he just called it World Political Status Report. That summed it all up, because he knew where everything was happening and what was happening all over the world. We learned so much in such a short time. Doug is brilliant and able to teach us so much, and we are so fortunate to have Doug donate his time and talent to our library group. Now today he picked a different topic, so we'll surprise you. He will tell you the topic and what it means. Before I begin, I always thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without them, I couldn't do it without you, and I couldn't do it without the wonderful help of the professors such as Doug Simon, who for the last 28 years or more has donated his time and talent to coming here. Thank you, Doug. I certainly appreciate it very much, and I learned so much. So please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guest.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you.
I'm thinking of taking up residency here at the library. 1989. Well, it's a pleasure, as always, to be here. When I originally wrote up this lecture, began to put it together, I titled it Human Rights versus National Interest. And in a way, I regret that, and I'm kind of glad I changed it, because it seriously narrows what I really wanted to talk about today. A somewhat broader perspective on human rights and those forces that hinder their protection, hinder the advancement of human rights. It is true that powerful national interests can and do inhibit the pursuit of human rights around the world, but there are really a variety of factors that clash with the notion that there are a universal set of rights that apply to all human beings, regardless of nationality, race, religion, or class. Sometimes this conflict is phrased as human rights versus realpolitik, as we have done today, or human rights versus pragmatism, human rights versus utilitarianism, and today it is increasingly seen as human rights versus national identity, and I'll have more to say about that in a little while. Many believe that the world's most vigorous action in the pursuit of human rights began in the post-World War II period after the horrors of the Holocaust. While this is by and large true, the philosophical ideas that form the basis of our notions of human rights, in fact, go back centuries. The earliest reference was made by the first Persian leader, Cyrus, or Cyrus the Great, on a baked clay cylinder in 539 BC. After his armies had conquered the city of Babylon, Cyrus freed the slaves and declared that all people had the right to choose their own religion and establish racial equality. The Cyrus cylinder, this clay cylinder, is now recognized as the world's first charter of human rights. From Babylon, the idea of human rights spread quickly to India, Greece, and eventually to Rome, where the concept of natural law emerged. Natural law is a body of unchanging moral principles regarded as a basis for all human conduct. In Western tradition, it stands in contrast to human-made law, based on things like pragmatism, convenience, greed, and prejudice. In the 13th century, Christianity contributed to the idea of natural law, particularly Thomas Aquinas, who contrasted several forms of law: eternal law, human law, divine law, and natural law. Now, eventually, this concept of natural law evolved into the notion of natural rights, largely through the Enlightenment, primarily in England, France, and the United States. While the likes of Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau all contributed to this effort, the leading mind in the development of human rights was John Locke, who in his second treatise on government in 1690 held that prior to the creation of society, as we know it today, held that prior to the creation of society, people were in a state of nature. In this primitive state, people enjoyed certain natural, inalienable rights, especially those of life, liberty, and property. However, these rights were not fully secure, and in order to protect those rights, a social contract is formed, establishing a government, providing a known and trusted judge to settle disputes, to fairly and impartially execute the law. And it is important to understand that this contract, according to Locke, the formation of a government, is based on popular consent. The government is to be responsible to the people. Put simply, what Locke did was to help foster a new way of thinking about individuals, governments, and the rights that link the two together. Previously, heads of state claimed to rule by divine right, something that Locke rejected. Now, the echoes of Locke are unmistakable in the language of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Listen from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Though written by Jefferson, the thought is right out of Locke. As the concept of universal human rights has evolved, we are talking about rights given to humans because they are human. It makes no difference if you are male or female, white, black, brown, whatever. Whether you are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, or atheist. Whether you are Bill Gates or a penniless, homeless woman on the streets of New York. You have these rights because you are human. What kind of principles are we talking about when we talk about human rights? Well, the litany of specific human rights and their variations is fairly extensive. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, agreed upon in 1948 at the United Nations, recognizes 30 rights, too many to read off in their entirety. So perhaps we might mention a few that are most often cited. Article 3 states, everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 9, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Articles 6 through 11 emphasize that human beings should be subject to the rule of law and specify various rights to equal justice. Articles 12, 13, and 14 specify the rights of privacy, freedom of movement, and the right to asylum. The Declaration goes on to note an individual's right to nationality, the right to marry, to own property, to have freedom of thought, the right to assembly, the right to participate in government, and the right to work. The Genocide Convention, also approved in 1948, clearly identified genocide, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, as impermissible, as well as the conspiracy to commit genocide. The principles of behavior governing the most egregious violations of human rights, like genocide and ethnic cleansing, were augmented in 2000 by a doctrine espoused by then United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, known as the responsibility to protect, or in short, R2P, responsibility to protect. In response to Annan's challenge, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, formed by the Canadian government, issued a report known as the Responsibility to Protect that outlined a state's responsibilities towards its own population and the international community's responsibility if the state fails to protect its citizens. One aim of the right to protect doctrine is to provide the legal as well as the ethical basis for international humanitarian intervention. That is, an internationally sanctioned multilateral military intervention in a country to prevent or to stop genocide. The doctrine was embraced by the UN General Assembly in 2005. Now, whether over the long haul it can be translated into meaningful action remains open to serious debate. Throughout much of the literature on human rights in general, it is frequently asserted that the most important factor hindering meaningful action on the part of states to prevent or to stop egregious human rights violations is national interest based on the notion of realpolitik. Certainly not the only factor, but perhaps the most important. As I noted earlier, things like ideology, religious beliefs, personal and group prejudices obviously play a role in stifling meaningful action against genocide and other human rights violations. But in today's world, and particularly for the United States, I would contend that realpolitik remains the most powerful factor in the decision-making process. Realpolitik is that paradigm used by a country's decision-makers as guides to their policies. The actual term realpolitik was coined in Germany in the 10th century, but more commonly finds its origins in the 16th century in the likes of Cardinal Richelieu of France and the Italian philosopher and writer Niccolò Machiavelli, the 15th century Italian diplomat, politician, historian, and philosopher. Machiavelli's The Prince was a blueprint for the pragmatic, seemingly ruthless acquisition and preservation of political power. Applied to international affairs, realpolitik is most often equated with pragmatism, with cost-benefit analysis. At the heart of realpolitik are a series of questions. Is this decision, this policy, consistent with or advance our national interest? Does it enhance our security, protect our sovereignty, increase our power? A current case in point is the response, or rather lack of response, of the international community to the increased persecution and imprisonment of China's Muslim Uyghur population. For years, particularly since 2016, the Uyghurs have been subject to harsh surveillance and forcing families to host Communist Party officials in their homes. And now it has been recently revealed that upward of 1 million members of this minority community are being held in internment camps. And yet, for obviously realpolitik reasons, the international community does little, if anything. The economic price of protesting against China, much less more aggressive action, is just too high. If realpolitik stands as an impediment to human rights and egregious violations do take place, how should they be dealt with? How do we achieve some semblance of justice? How do we hold the perpetrators of serious human rights violations accountable for their actions? In that regard, the international community has made some progress in recent decades with the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. This is different from the World Court, by the way. World Court was one of the original organs of the United Nations and hears disputes between countries. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, goes after individuals, generals and leaders, presidents, premiers, and so forth, that are responsible for these human rights violations. It has to date opened investigations into the mass killings in northern Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Darfur in the Sudan, and the Republic of Kenya. And as many of you know, a number of ad hoc courts have been established dealing with the former Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia. Are these instruments of justice perfect? No, obviously not. There have been successful prosecutions like those against over 90 individuals who committed serious crimes during the 1994 Balkan Wars, including Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian general convicted of war crimes. But there have been accusations that the International Criminal Court in particular has not been sensitive to varying cultural mores, that there is an anti-African bias to the case selection, that there has been a lack of transparency in the prosecutor's choice of cases. But perhaps most important, while 123 countries have ratified the treaty establishing the International Court, others have not. 7 countries voted against the founding agreement: Iraq, Libya, Qatar, Yemen, Israel, China, and the United States. Other key countries have refused to join, including India and Russia. Their rationales for not joining the court are certainly consistent with the whole notion of realpolitik. Variations on the themes of national security and the protection of sovereignty. Indeed, just 2 or 3 days ago, the President's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, launched a fierce attack on the ICC, calling it a dangerous threat to national security. Now, throughout American history, human rights have played a role in the country's foreign policy. And this is important because the United States was founded on a Constitution and Bill of Rights that proclaimed freedom and individual liberties. And because of this reality, dealing with human rights issues abroad is particularly difficult for American presidents. Leaders of dictatorships can easily ignore human rights. Leaders of countries like the United States, whose very founding embraces human rights, cannot, or at least should not, ignore them. Whether it was Franklin Roosevelt in the Holocaust, Harry Truman in the immediate post-Holocaust era, Gerald Ford with the genocide in Cambodia, Bill Clinton and the horrors of Bosnia and Rwanda, or George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Darfur, all were confronted with staggering human rights tragedies. The fact is that in the modern era of U.S. foreign policy, there has always been a degree of tension between the advocacy of human rights and the pursuit of national interest, particularly security interest, and no president has been immune from that tension. Let me comment on some of the more critical human rights dilemmas that have faced presidents. After Watergate, Gerald Ford was in the unfortunate situation of gaining the presidency by default and inheriting the ending of the Vietnam War and facing a genocide in Cambodia. In the case of Cambodia, slaughter by the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1978 resulted in the deaths of nearly 2 million Cambodians out of a total population of 9 million. 2 million out of 9 million. The U.S. faced 2 huge factors in the realpolitik decision calculation whether or not to intervene. First, it had already spent billions and billions of dollars and lost tens of thousands of lives of American service personnel in a fruitless 10-year war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and was not about to plunge back into the same region to try to stop the killing in Cambodia. Second, the cold, hard political reality was that the American public, fed up with the Vietnam War, would never tolerate military re-entry into that region. These pragmatic factors clearly overrode any moral imperative to try to stop the killing. 2 million out of 9. In citing these 2 factors, I do not want to oversimplify the situation and place exclusive blame for inaction squarely on the president and his advisors. The failure to act must be borne by almost the entirety of American society that basically turned a blind eye to the slaughter in Cambodia. It is true that in the beginning, information about what was going on was scarce. And it is also true that President Ford and elements within the military and the intelligence community predicted at least some sort of bloodbath would occur if the anti-communist Long Nol government fell to the Khmer Rouge. Hence Ford's almost chaotic attempts to help military aid flowing to the Cambodian government well into 1975. But by then, the American public and press was highly skeptical of whatever the government said based on their Vietnam experience. As the first couple of years passed and stories began to emerge as to the horrors that were taking place, most of the American public either did not believe them or just ignored them. By 1978, after 3 years of killing, only one major government official publicly called for a military intervention. And that, believe it or not, was Senator George Mcgovern of South Dakota, the long-term anti-war activist and the 1972 Democratic presidential candidate. He was the only one. The point here being that while presidents may bear some responsibility for inaction in thwarting genocide, in a case like Cambodia, there is plenty of blame to go around. In the Reagan administration, strategic interest overshadowed human rights concerns with South Africa and its official policy of apartheid that clearly legitimized separation and discrimination based on race. For the Reagan administration, the central concern was growing Soviet and Cuban influence in the South African region. I'm missing a page. That's really jarring when that happens. But basically what happened was that the government engaged in a policy of accommodation with the South Africans, the South African government. But the public, the American public, rose up and protested and put pressure on the government and on corporations in particular to levy sanctions and boycotts of South African economy. That eventually took hold, and the government had to adhere to that, and eventually apartheid was abandoned. The case of the Clinton administration was very serious. Bill Clinton had problems almost immediately out of the gate with China. In fact, it was argued that the opening of China economically would inevitably lead to greater democracy and human rights in the country. Unfortunately, no such thing occurred. Clinton did finally act in the case of the human rights situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the mid-1990s and in Kosovo, but only after NATO had dawdled around far too long. But his greatest human rights crisis was in Rwanda. In Rwanda in 1994, the U.S. and the international community basically stood aside as nearly 1 million Tutsis were slaughtered by Hutu. Why did they stand aside? Why didn't anybody go in and try to stop it or establish safe zones for the Tutsis to find some sense of security? Why the almost universal failure of the United States and other states in the international system to act? The decision makers in Washington knew what was going on. Unlike the situation in Cambodia, where it was clouded in mystery for the first couple of years, there was nothing mysterious about what was happening in Rwanda. They could hardly declare ignorance. Again, cold realpolitik calculations took over. The situation in Rwanda did not threaten American interest. There were no vital strategic interests in the region in terms of geography or strategic resources that we absolutely had to protect. We had also just come off a disastrous intervention in Somalia, scene of the famous Black Hawk Down tragedy in which 18 American servicemen were killed and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. That was not going to happen again. The calculation was made that the expenditure of resources to stop genocide were just not worth it. Again, realpolitik overrode any moral imperative. Years later, Clinton admitted that the decision not to intervene in Rwanda was the greatest failure of his administration. To his credit, the Bush administration was pretty forthright on the business of human rights, particularly when it came to Darfur. Although not unexpectedly, political priorities sometimes complicated the effort. And the Bush administration human rights record during the War on Terror, with its use of enhanced interrogation, endless incarceration, and heavy civilian casualties resulting from the use of drones, were a real problem. Now, a review of Obama's major human rights decisions shows a somewhat mixed record. In fact, he often treated human rights as a secondary interest. Nice to support when the cost was not too high, but nothing like a top priority he championed during his campaign for the presidency. Early in his administration, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, created a furor in human rights circles when, upon landing in Beijing, said she would continue to press China on issues such as human rights, but she added, our pressing on those issues cannot interfere with the global economic crisis, the global climate change crisis, and the security crisis. This was widely viewed, and I think accurately, as a setting of priorities by the Obama administration. Obama was slow on closing Guantanamo, and ultimately that failed. On domestic surveillance, he not only continued, but he expanded programs begun by George Bush that led to massive invasions of privacy within the United States. Only after Edward Snowden's revelations did he institute some reforms. On most domestic human rights issues, he was very progressive, such as civil rights, support of the LGBT community, and on immigration. But on the foreign front, he had a pretty ineffective response to the widespread slaughter of Syrian civilians by forces under Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Similarly, there was the controversy over the proposed action by the U.S. Congress to recognize the Armenian Genocide of 1915 that resulted in the deaths of between 1 and 1.5 million people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. For what seemed an eminently pragmatic reason, namely the preservation of good relations with the Turkish government, President Obama encouraged Congress to reject the legislation, to not call it a genocide. And this was a reversal of position for Obama. During the presidential campaign, he labeled the Armenian slaughter as genocide and said the United States should do likewise. But once in office, he was confronted with some uncomfortable realities. Turkey was a valued NATO ally that repeatedly allowed us to have basing facilities on their territory, as well as the right to overfly their airspace. Further, Turkey is viewed in Washington as an indispensable bridge between the West and the Islamic countries of the Middle East. Realpolitik? Absolutely. One black mark during the Obama administration concerned the country of Myanmar, formerly the country of Burma. Throughout its second term, the administration downplayed mounting evidence that Myanmar's Rohingya community was being deliberately eradicated by the country's military. Genocide was an inconvenient fact for an administration eager to claim a foreign policy achievement in Myanmar's democratic transition. With the U.S. help in 2015 and 16, the country had been transformed from a pariah military dictatorship into a democracy. But the reality was that Myanmar had a deplorable religious freedom record and was engaging in widespread ethnic cleansing and mass murder, and the Obama administration, for realpolitik reasons, did virtually nothing. Now, one interesting and perhaps encouraging development during the Obama administration was when then Director of National Intelligence Dennis Blair testified in front of Congress. In his testimony, Blair noted that the administration had added mass killing to the list of potential threats to national security. This was unprecedented. No previous administration had ever made such a statement. This was followed by an item in Obama's quadrennial defense review stating that the Defense Department should be prepared to offer the president with options for, quote, preventing human suffering due to mass atrocities. And finally, President Obama formed a high-level interagency committee at the National Security Council aimed at anticipating and preventing mass atrocities. Now, all of this, of course, is positive, but we all know that public statements and the formation of task forces do not necessarily translate into action. Further, there's every reason to believe that even given a higher degree of planning to deal with these situations, the actual decisions to try and prevent or halt mass killings was still using realpolitik as a guide. Nevertheless, it was not unreasonable to conclude that the Obama administration was at least rethinking Washington's response to genocide. And this brings us to the Trump administration. Very early in his first year in office, there were some signs worth noting. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, his early remarks to the State Department employees was the following. He stated that promoting values creates obstacles to our ability to advance our national security interests and other economic interests. Another clue as to the priority human rights might hold had to do with the redefinition of roles within the White House. The White House used to have a senior National Security Council post called Special Assistant to the President for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. The staffer coordinated, developed, and helped implement government policy related to human rights and humanitarian relief, issues like refugees assistance, human trafficking, and the laws of war. Under Trump, the title for this position has been changed to Special Assistant for International Organizations and Alliances, period. The words human rights have been excised, and further, the person named to the post by Trump, Gary Hall, has absolutely no background in human rights policy. The human rights community has made a big deal out of Trump's heavy support of Saudi Arabia. That has certainly less than a sterling human rights record. But frankly, that's not news. U.S. presidents have been cuddling up to Saudi royalty for years for their oil, their heavy purchases of American weapon systems, and because of their hostility to Iran. Virtually all presidents find themselves dealing with leaders of other countries with abominable human rights record, and Donald Trump is no exception. But are there limits? One troubling incident occurred in late April of last year when President Trump reached out to Rodrigo Duterte, the leader of the Philippines, who has invoked Hitler's mass extermination of the Jews as a model for how he would like to dispose of drug dealers and addicts. He set up police hit squads that summarily killed hundreds of street children, drug addicts, and dealers. In what the White House aides called a very friendly conversation, Trump congratulated Duterte for doing an unbelievable job on the drug problem and invited him to the White House. Now, to be fair, however, in September of 2017, the Trump administration fast-tracked $32 million in fresh aid to a new wave of Rohingya refugees who had fled into Bangladesh and soon began applying what is known as the Magnitsky Act, a series of sanctions against Myanmar's military. Ambassador-at-Large for International Religious Freedom Sam Brownback visited the Rohingya refugees in his first official trip and dispatched investigators to collect evidence of genocide. So the Trump administration is not totally devoid of concern and action on human rights. But then there are the policies dealing with illegal immigration. Now in this talk, in this presentation, I am really not interested in arguing the extent to which we do or do not have secure borders, whether we should have a wall, and whether illegal immigrants should have paths to citizenship or be deported to their home countries. Those are critical questions for another time. What is relevant, however, is the manner in which illegal immigrants and those seeking asylum are treated. For many Americans, and particularly the human rights community, the record here is, to say the least, controversial. Some would say inhumane, particularly the separation of children from their parents. Since when do we use the traumatic separation of young children from their parents as a political weapon, attempting to establish a deterrence to illegal immigration? Well, supporters of the policy say, quote, "It was the parents that brought them. It was their responsibility." Well, in the first place, a 3-year-old child not only has no choice in the matter, he or she barely knows what is going on, if at all. Secondly, the case can be made that to be forced to remain in a murderous Honduran environment is inhumane, and certainly the alternative idea of leaving children behind to fend for themselves in order to find safety is probably equally immoral. The fact is that we do not yet have a clear view of the current administration's human rights policies. No doubt, like presidents before him, Donald Trump will be buffeted between human rights and national security interest. What is of concern is that with the administration's quest to aggressively deal with immigration, engage in hardball trade policy, and with a highly national self-interest policy of making America great again, President Trump will completely obliterate human rights considerations from his foreign policy. This might well signal a return to the Kissingerian era, Henry Kissinger's era, of total realpolitik. That human rights will play virtually no role, with perhaps the exception of periodic verbal statements in their favor, but no action. It is important to note that none of these presidents, at least those who have served out their terms, certainly not Ford, not Reagan, not Clinton, not George Bush, not Obama, none of them argued that human rights had no place in U.S. policy. Each believed that with certain caveats that the United States' support for human rights contributed to its distinctiveness. None expressed any desire to return to a value-free foreign policy, an amoral realism that briefly reigned in the 1970s, largely under the influence of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And while I have not spoken about every post-World War II president, there is one that I have conspicuously avoided. The presidency of one James Earl Carter. Unlike any president in the post-World War II era, Carter dramatically made human rights a centerpiece of his administration. Human rights were elevated to a place right alongside traditional national security concerns. In fact, they were viewed as not only compatible, but essential for each other. For Carter, the pursuit of human rights goals advanced our security interests, helping to establish a system of world order based on the aspirations of people and on the rule of law. Massive human rights violations like ethnic cleansing and genocide are wrecking balls, creators of chaos and instability. They play havoc with economic commerce and are anything but in the interest of peaceful nations. Advancing freedom internationally was in line with America's values and would serve the national interest. Carter argued that U.S. security would be enhanced by the expansion of human rights and democracy around the world. Finally, human rights goals could be effectively pursued along with other foreign policy objectives. Carter rejected this linkage argument put forward by Kissinger, which held that promoting human rights would necessarily jeopardize other foreign policy goals. The United States, he said, should and would press for human rights objectives together with political, economic, and military goals in its bilateral relations. So what is the reality of American human rights policy? With the exception of Jimmy Carter, I would contend that we are long on moral pronouncements, short on action, and action is basically subservient to realpolitik considerations. In light of this, why do we continue to issue statement after statement supporting human rights and decrying the violation of human rights in other countries? Why do we do that? We consistently do that. Well, I think we do it, quite frankly, for realpolitik reasons. We do it to embarrass them, to try to show our values in comparison to these other values. Well, when it comes to action, we are certainly lacking. Well, that raises a question. Is the American government, our institutions, devoid of people, of personnel, of office holders who are, how can we say this, morally neutral? Who don't care about human rights? Who only care about political reality? The answer is no. Those kinds of people do exist and demonstrate considerable courage in fighting for what they believe is right. For instance, it is well known that Vice President Al Gore strongly advocated some sort of military intervention into Rwanda to stop the slaughter of Tutsis. Now, ultimately, it was not his decision. It was the president's decision, President Clinton. But he advocated it. And within the White House inner circle, President Bush, on more than one occasion, expressed a desire to send in a military force to stop the killing in Darfur, only to be told by the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, no, Mr. President, we cannot do that. We cannot invade another Muslim country. Again, realpolitik. The sad fact is, as Samantha Power put it in her remarkable book, The Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, the United States has been incredibly consistent in the face of contemporary genocide. We lead the world community as bystanders. Bystanders to the tragedies as they unfold. Not only do we not militarily intervene to stop the killing or intervene too late, as in the case of Bosnia and Kosovo, we more often than not take very few what might be termed more moderate steps to at least try and end the slaughters. We are essentially bystanders. And I would contend that this is no accident. Cold cost-benefit calculations are made based on perceived national interest. In other words, realpolitik. But perhaps I've painted a one-sided picture here. For instance, one might contend that there are not only legal and pragmatic reasons for presidents to protect American interest and American lives, but perhaps a moral obligation as well. That it is immoral for a president to unnecessarily risk the lives of American service men and women. That it is immoral for a president not to make a practical calculation as to the feasibility of a military intervention, rather than to recklessly engage in an operation doomed to failure or catastrophe. But even if you accept this line of argument, there can be problems. For instance, in the case of Rwanda, a military feasibility assessment was made. And the reality was that a rather modest-sized American or multilateral force could have established numerous viable safe zones in Rwanda and with relative ease put down the Hutu slaughter of Tutsis. One of the reasons it would have been relatively easy was that the genocide that was taking place was not done with firearms. Tragically, it was primarily done with machetes. But if you sent well-armed servicemen in there, they could deal with that with less risk to themselves. Now let me conclude with a comment on two trends that have the potential for a global human rights disaster in the not-too-distant future. The first is the growing number of internally displaced people, refugees, and asylum seekers around the world. In 2017, these three groups, 40 million internally displaced people, 25.4 million refugees crossing borders, and 3.1 million asylum seekers, combined for a record total of 68.5 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. This is the largest number since the end of World War II and the founding of the United Nations. These people are displaced as a result of both civil and interstate wars in places like Syria, from widespread drug-related gang-based murder campaigns in Central America, from growing drought, as in North and East Africa, from devastating storm patterns in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, from discrimination and vicious ethnic cleansing as witnessed in Myanmar against the Rohingya, from failed states where ineffective or non-existent government has brought political and societal chaos as in countries like Libya and Somalia. Where do these people go? Where do they find shelter? Where do they find food and water? Who takes care of them if they cannot help themselves? The United Nations and non-governmental relief agencies are overwhelmed. Nearly 70 million people, a large percentage of are on the move, often across state borders, in order to survive. And when they do cross into other countries, they are often looked upon as outsiders, as intruders, people of different color, religion, and culture. And that in and of itself can be a problem, as we know. The second trend is the rise of extreme right-wing hyper-nationalist populist movements founded not just on nationalist rhetoric, but the preservation of a particular dominant group based in many cases on race or religion. This is not merely some American phenomenon as reflected in the Trump campaign and presidency, filled with anti-Mexican, Central American, and Muslim rhetoric. These movements, many of them reflecting not only populism but strains of authoritarianism, have gained substantial ground across Europe and in places like Turkey, Egypt, and India. Viktor Orbán in Hungary is one of the most successful of the right-wing authoritarians. He is the Prime Minister of Hungary, who has threatened to shut down non-governmental organizations that help refugees and has removed substantial constitutional checks and balances. Matteo Salvini, leader of Italy's junior governing party, has pledged to deport 500,000 irregular migrants, says joining the euro was a mistake, and wants to end all sanctions against Russia. And there are others in countries such as Austria, France, Denmark, Slovenia, and Poland, where the authoritarian right has made enormous strides. Perhaps the most disturbing case is that of India, where Narendra Modi came to power as Prime Minister in 2014. Among other things, Modi has banned 11,000 non-governmental organizations in India that work with the poor and the marginalized. He regularly incites religious hatred, and as a result of his fear-mongering and general hysteria, Hindu mobs have started attacking and lynching Muslims and low-caste Hindus on a regular basis. But Modi and his party's targets are not confined to Muslims. Its targets have also included Christian groups who they accuse of forcibly converting Hindus to Christianity. And so we have these two trends. Tens of millions of displaced people desperately moving across borders to seek safety, and targeting countries reacting by bringing to power right-wing nationalist leaders who lead parties committed to preserving what they see as their national culture, values, and in some cases religion and race. All of this does not bode well for human rights. In virtually every case, these political movements have sought to demonize others, the others, people of different skin color, language, and faith that in their eyes and in their followers pose a threat, physical, cultural, religious, and economic threat. Muslims and lower caste in India, Mexican, Central Americans, Muslims in the United States, North Africans and Middle Easterners in Europe, and on and on. Now, I do want to make something quite clear. When I talk about hyper-nationalist, populist political movements practicing the most extreme forms of identity politics, I am not talking about we in the West consider mainstream conservative or libertarian thinking. Obviously, there is a place in our political fabric for both conservative and liberal thinking and dialogue. How large or small should government be? Protectionism, free trade, or fair trade? Is deficit spending a blessing or a curse? And there are more than legitimate arguments to make with regard to both legal and illegal immigration. But what I am talking about is the really dangerous game of identity politics, where we enact public policy on the basis of judgments on things like the color of one's skin and their religion. For me, and I believe for many others, That kind of thinking runs counter to the whole concept of human rights, that there are intrinsic rights possessed by all human beings because they are human. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer.
Absorb it all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
The end justifies the means. That's what it seems
Yeah.
to me. Is that right?
Yeah.
And also, money plays the most important part, obviously, because if people have jobs and security, they're not so scared of the immigrant.
Well, but scared is the right word. And the question is it really things like immigrants that are displacing people? In other words, psychologically, the fear is there. The empirical evidence is not so clear when it comes to this country. The biggest job displacer in this country is automation, robotics, technology, artificial intelligence. It's not immigrants. And probably a third of the illegal immigrants that come across are doing jobs that basically white Americans will not do. The bosses can't hire them. You can't get hundreds and hundreds of white citizens in California, Nevada, Arizona, and so forth, just to work the fields, to harvest lettuce or whatever it may be, and that's a fact. So it is not that there were not jobs displaced by the flight of industry to China and so forth, but the whole notion that these Americans, white working class Americans, have been displaced from their jobs because of illegal immigration is basically a fantasy. It's a myth. But the fear is there. You're right back. Right, yeah.
Two-part question. I read an article recently in Forbes about global capitalism and that humanity would be starved by 2050. Do you think that the socialism wave is coming is going to happen? And can we survive global capitalism?
That's a really good question.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, the question really had to do with this recent political thrust of socialism and democratic socialism. We saw it with the woman who was elected, young woman who was elected in Brooklyn, nominated for the House of Representatives in the November election. We see it, and Bernie Sanders, a democratic socialist. And this is occurring in part as a precursor, if you will, to the death of capitalism, because capitalism's just gone too far, particularly in enhancing and widening the gap between the have and the have-nots. Internally, primarily. I mean, there's always been this gap between the have and the have-nots, between rich countries and poor countries, but the gap in this country between the rich and the poor has gotten wider and wider. More people added to the poverty polls. The 2008 disaster, the recovery was just great for that upper 1 or 2%. They made lots of money in part because they are the ones that have huge investments in the stock market and so forth. For most working class people, it didn't help. Their wages basically stagnated, even during the recovery. So you have this widening gap, and capitalism, according to those that believe in the socialist and democratic socialist model, was responsible for this. Let me answer it this way. I'm not sure it's black and white. This is something that's very complex. I think capitalism has its place. And I think capitalism as an engine of growth, as a generator of wealth, and as certainly the potential for instituting upward mobility within societies is very real. Unchecked capitalism that runs amok is a problem. We saw this with child labor during the early part of the Industrial Revolution. We saw it with the working conditions that people in this country worked under, while the Rockefellers and Carnegies and so forth got unbelievably rich, you know. So I think there is a place for regulation of a capitalist system. The problem right now is that we are in an era of deregulation. I mean, we're taking regulations off right and left, most of which the American public has no concept of. And I would be the first one to admit there are some pretty ridiculous regulations, and the system needs to be cleaned up periodically. But just, I think capitalism in its purest form has some real dangers in it. Maybe the socialist, democratic socialist movement will go in that direction. We're going to know a lot more after the November elections. Now, the November elections, even if the Democrats take the House, or even the more unlikely thing, they take the House and the Senate, that's not going to, quote, solve the problem, but it will act as an indicator that something is wrong, something is taking place with the direction of the American public, the American economy right now. So I think it's a gray area. I wouldn't even predict. I think it is very unfortunate, particularly in this country, that the word socialism is being used. There is a huge difference between democratic socialism, which you have in many of the European countries, or have had, and pure socialism. Okay? Democratic socialism, you still got most of the economy is free enterprise. It's only certain key industries and public service areas that the government, in fact, owns. So to say that democratic socialism somehow equates to communism is just pure fantasy. It's nonsense. It doesn't. Democratic socialism means things like single-payer health care.
How about Social Security?
We already have a lot of democratic socialist policies like Social Security, like Medicare, and so forth. So, yeah. So it's a gray area. I think history has yet to be written on
A
this.
lot of people want to destroy even that.
Yeah.
Social Security,
Yeah, I
Medicare,
know.
welfare.
It's not going to happen. Yeah,
To go to the value side of it,
yeah.
how about the United Nations, that, I mean, the whole idea after 1945 was that countries would then
Yeah.
be of the value side.
Yeah.
So,
Well, unfortunately, you're right. You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the United Nations has countries that are represented, and those countries are represented by human beings. And human beings are fraught with hypocrisy. They're flawed. And people ask me all the time about the effectiveness of the United Nations, and I say, well, it's really done some terrific work in what we call the soft areas, development and public health and so forth. There's some really marvelous stuff, and not just token stuff, really marvelous stuff. In the really dicey area of security, prevention of wars, stopping genocides and so forth, at the very best, there are a few peacekeeping operations that have kind of held the line for a while, but by and large it's been a failure. And it's been a failure because 5 countries in the Security Council control the vote, and they vote on the basis of national self-interest. You know, China, Russia, the United States, and so forth. The General Assembly does not make laws. It passes resolutions that are recommendations only. The two areas in which the United Nations systems makes, quote, laws are in the Security Council, which is controlled by the big powers, and in the World Court. Those decisions have a weight of law. So it's really tough. It's really tough. Yeah.
Oh.
I'll do second. You just go ahead first and I'll get you
In terms
next.
of when they were just talking of, people who may be running for office or coming up, they mentioned Bloomberg and they said
Yeah.
he's, considered a moderate,
Yeah.
which has almost been dead between the far left and the far right. There's nothing in the middle where I always used to be.
Well, you and a lot of other people. Essentially, the American political fabric is centrist in nature. I'm not going to say that what we have now with this separation of the Republican and Democratic parties is something new. We've had periods of split. Lord knows, the Civil War. We've had splits, horrible splits. But in general, certainly in most of the post-World War II period, the American electorate was very moderate. It was not extreme. And I just don't know. I will tell you a little, this is a personal thing, I'll just tell you right now. Mike Bloomberg was my favorite candidate running for president in the last election. I wished that he had. And done it early.
Sure.
Because here's a guy who was a Republican, who moves as an independent. He's a progressive Republican. I'm a Democrat, but I don't care. He was a progressive. He would have been a really good candidate. His only problem is he's rich and he's from New York. Now, we all know because of Donald Trump, you can overcome the rich part. Whether you can overcome the New York part, I'm not so sure. The great Midwest hates the Eastern establishment. You know, and Mike Bloomberg is about as Eastern establishment as you're going to get. So I understand that he's now considering the possibility in the next presidential election of running. It'll be interesting to see if he does. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Well, I'm trying to look ahead,
Yeah.
and you say when things hit the fan because of the climate, then you're going to have ripple effects with famines. Or now, when it comes to national interests, let's say that we're all divided, or a big arena, every country for himself. Would we survive without developing a new sense of interdependence?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. There was, in the 1960s, there was a book produced called A Report from Iron Mountain. I don't know if you're very familiar with it. And it tells the story of a summit meeting of great thinkers, industrialists, academics, and so forth that took place in Iron Mountain, Colorado. And they were to come and try to come up with plans to fix the world, basically. This was in the 1960s. And after long deliberations, they came to the conclusion that the only thing that was going to unite humankind was an extraterrestrial threat. Because it threatened everybody, okay? Now, as it turned out, it was a hoax. When it first came out, people read it, it was on the New York Times bestseller list, and everybody said, wow, what a great conference. How come we didn't know about it? Well, you didn't know about it because it didn't happen. But that didn't stop people from thinking about this. And I would contend, and I've been asked this question before, or some variation of it, maybe the climate change threat, which I think is very real,
Very serious.
in some respects, may act in a similar way to that extraterrestrial threat, because everybody's going to be threatened. It is very serious. I am absolutely, probably if you push me up against the wall, as a person in international relations and foreign policy and in politics, the thing that bothers me the most, the bottom line thing that bothers me the most about the current administration is its total rejection of science, and particularly the whole climate change business. It is something that is beginning to occur in front of our eyes, and yet we do nothing about it. There are people in government who are very worried. Now, a lot of people criticize the military and the Pentagon for a whole variety of reasons. They're one of the few governmental agencies that very early identified climate change as a national security threat. There are contingency plans that they have written for all the coastal bases, ports, bases, airports, everything that around the world, not just in the United States, that the U.S. military operates from. Contingency plans for evacuation, alternative facilities, and so forth, because they have identified climate change as a very real threat. It is possible that if things really get bad, and they could, with both sea levels, more extreme weather, and so forth, as we're beginning to see now, that it would be a uniting phenomenon. I don't know that, and I'm not going to predict that. I'm not going to predict that. You could also say that it's every man for himself to survive that kind of disaster. That we're going to husband our resources and try to adapt. You know, we're not going to go out there with some kind of, you know, global policy on global warming. I don't know what's going to happen with that. My hope would be that if we continue to ignore the problem and not deal with it, not only as a country but globally, that if things get really bad, and they may well, that it will be a unifying factor. But it's very difficult to predict. Yeah.
One of the political issues that keeps coming up is the question as to whether or not the country, the United States, can play the role of an international police force.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, we've tried. I don't know how successful we've been in different places, but
I think that the problem is not that I don't think it's so much that we try to be international policemen. In some respects, I think, and you're not alone, I mean, there are tons of writers on this. I'm not so sure we're always doing that. I think that what we set out to do is to protect what we perceive to be in our national interest. And those includes foreign interests, whether it's bases, key strategic countries, or so forth. And the problem is that we consistently misidentify the problem. The classic example is Vietnam. We saw Vietnam as a continuation of the containment policy. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese are going to flood into the Indochina Peninsula. We can't tolerate that. Therefore, we first send advisors, then we start sending regular troops. And we ended up with 60,000 dead Americans. And ended up actually losing the war. North Vietnam took over the South. Complete misidentification of the problem. It's not that it's incorrect at certain points of time to send our navies and our military out to protect certain resources that may be threatened. But we keep misidentifying the problem, number one. Secondly, we're not very good at predicting consequences. Iraq and Afghanistan are classic examples. You know, when we first went into Afghanistan, most people thought, oh, we're going to go in there, bomb the hell out of the Al-Qaeda training camps, turn around and go home. And if necessary, a year later, we'll go back and do it again. That's not what happened. We went in there and decided to become nation builders. We're going to build schools and medical clinics. We're going to convert this country that had never been controlled. You know, there was a reason that they called it the graveyard of empires. The Russians tried it, the British tried it. It's ridiculous. Alexander the Great tried it. They all failed. Where are the people in government with any sense of history? I mean, it's not just Donald Trump that's somewhat ignorant of history. There's a lot of presidents ignorant of history. We should have known. We should have looked at what the Russian experience was a disaster. They sent thousands, tens of thousands of Russian troops, all kinds of mechanized equipment, Hind helicopters, it failed. They failed. And yet, right after they left, Al-Qaeda comes in, takes out the World Trade Center in Washington, the Pentagon and so forth, and we're right back in it again. The neocons in the White House, boy, Iraq, they said it. They said it openly. We're going in there because this is the opportunity to spread democracy. We bring down the president of Iraq, the authoritarian leader, Saddam Hussein. This is the opportunity for democracy in the Middle East. It's going to spread like wildfire. What happened? It's a disaster. And led to all kinds of consequences like the creation of ISIS and so. So I think that's the problem. It's not just that we feel we have to pay policemen of the world. I think if we were genuinely policemen of the world, if we really believed that, we would have gone in to Rwanda and stopped the genocide. Darfur, we would have gone in, but we didn't. So I think it's misidentification of the problems. Yeah.
Wouldn't you argue too that there's a lot of money to be made in some of these places? I mean, Iraq, Iran, Vietnam, even Vietnam, the defense contractors made millions.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
And those are, to me, those are the types of places that.
Yeah, money's a big problem. I mean, it's a problem in our domestic political system, it's a problem in our foreign policy. There's no denying that. There's no denying that. It's a flawed system. But, you know, those big corporations and the Bendix Corporation and whatnot, the big defense contractor, you know, they generate jobs, they generate money, they generate wealth. They're just part of the system.
But at what cost?
Oh, that's a good question. Excellent question. Listen, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Good question. Well, I'm a great believer in Malcolm Muggeridge, who once said, you know, human beings, for all the crises, will muddle through somehow.
Human
Thank you
beings
so much.
with all the
I hope you
crises
enjoyed
will
this
muddle
as much
through.
as I did from this. Now when you read the papers, you'll really understand what's happening all over the world. And when I said he's brilliant and a genius, I wasn't kidding. Thank you all for coming to help us
Yeah, that's what I said.
Ceramic terrible.
But you didn't get any. It was very
Don't be just listening to it. They pay.